Okay. So we'll just get started with a couple of basic questions because we're posting it online. Maybe people don't know you yet. So,
Yeah.
what's your name, degree year, campaign color, and slogan?
My name's Prudence Wilkins-Wheat. My campaign color is yellow. I study arts law, majoring in English, and I'm in my 4th year. And my slogan is Prove for USU.
Cool. And who is your campaign manager slash campaign managers?
I have quite a few. I have Liam, who is the SRC president, Keta, they are the ACAR officer, Olte, another ACAR officer, Himat, I think the global solidarity officer, and Ella, who's really involved in debating.
Cool.
Groovy. So are you in a political party? Dash, can you please describe your politics to us?
Yep. So I am not in any federally aligned political party. So I'm in Switch and Grassroots, which are more activist network-based groups on campus. So a lot of like office bearers and collectives get involved in Grassroots and Switch. I would describe my politics as left-wing. Obviously, I'm anti-racism, sexism, classism, ableism, queerphobia, all that. I definitely prioritize minorities and discriminated groups, and I like to platform and empower voices specifically who have been affected I'm obviously for like decolonization. That's kind of broadly the principles and precepts of something like Grassroots and Switch as well.
Cool. You answered my next question, which was about your faction. So why are you running for USU board?
So this is, for me, a really important question. So I apologize if this goes on for a little, I'm sorry if this turns into like some weird speech, but I remember last year when I got asked that question, and I think I said something about the importance of a progressive union, about as representation, and also the USU affirming its values, very similar to the ones that I have about racism, sexism, and about ensuring that people who are being affected by oppression and discrimination have means of having protection within the USU, and also having means of feeling like they're being represented and taken care of. And that was something that I felt I learned from the SRC, and that's why I really want to see engagement with the SRC. And a lot of that had been informed by, I think at the time I started like being a student ambassador. And so part of that role was about the fact that I had to call students who were first years and who were specifically struggling because they were in difficult degrees, or because they were particularly vulnerable, maybe because they were international students, and what sort of issues were facing them. And a lot of them said stuff like discrimination. A lot of them said, issues of like from socioeconomic backgrounds. So that sort of stuff really informed me. But after I obviously withdrew from the USU, I had a lot of time to really think more about how that was really particularly going to manifest in the USU. How, why did I want to be a board director? What was I trying to achieve? And something that I think is a problem with USU and board directors specifically is that we often come into these positions on the back foot. A lot of us don't really know what we're doing. A lot of us have a lot of ideas, but not really plans. So what does it mean to have a more progressive union? What does it mean to revive Manning? What do all these things mean in principle? How do they actually manifest? And something that I kind of came to the conclusion was that a lot of us just don't know a lot about the administration of the USU. So what I did in response to that was stuff like get a USU job. So I worked as a student activities officer for like a couple days every week for about a year. And that meant that I had a lot of engagement and I learned a lot about the USU. Other stuff is like talking to, when making my policy, I like interviewed different presidents of club societies and directors of reviews and USU staff. And I learned a lot from that. And then even getting involved with SRC, and when I got elected as environment officer, which was completely distinct from the USU, everything about that, I still learned a lot about activism and how to really engage in left-wing politics, and how to actually be more than a dissenting voice in the USU, but actually how to use the sort of mechanisms in the USU to express progressive politics. And that came out of stuff like meetings with the facilities manager for the USU about Sustainability Week, and how can we make Sustainability Week more educational, rather than what it currently had been, which was more about focusing on, I guess, real sustainability and sponsorships and I guess those corporate relationships. And so the way I kind of perceive a board director, and what I've come to the conclusion about the importance of the USU, is that the board director oversees student experience, but student experience inherently has two parts, which is student culture, which I think a lot of students focus on, and the other part is student support, which is about stuff like making sure there is really good sexual harassment and sexual assault training for people who do go to camps, or making sure we are decolonizing Wentworth, or making sure that we have a disability space. All those things are a part of the USU and a part of the responsibilities you take on when you become a board director. And I think that's something that you'll hear from a lot of candidates about student support and student culture. But I think what differentiates me in comparison, besides the experience and like the passion, is the fact that you need to have a leader who's willing to advocate and represent and defend students. And you can have all the information in the world and you can have all the experience in the world, but if you aren't able to put yourself out there and have a really articulate argument with people in a room who defend you, whose priorities are actively against you, then you aren't going to, I think, really live up to a lot of the promises you're making. And that's something that I feel like I can do. Even though I hate these elections, I think they're so stressful, I come back because I think that I'm really passionate about the visions I have for the USU, and I really believe that I'm someone that students can trust to actually deliver on a positive and effective vision for the USU.
All right.
Sorry.
Thanks so much. So would you say it's mainly, you think, your experience and your ability to defend your ideas? Do you think that makes you better placed than the other candidates running?
I think it's part of it. I think it's beneficial just inherently in the fact that when you come into the USU, I think firstly you're exhausted after doing a campaign, but also you have to learn who the personalities are, how it works, what's the administration, how does an executive work? It doesn't work in the same way like a club does. And you have to also come against like a lot of knowledge hierarchies, and you have to come up against a lot of, experience hierarchies with people who are like CEOs and who really feel like they probably know better than you. And that's a massive obstacle that I feel like, even if I'm not at the same degree of those individuals, and I can't say that I'm, going to be perfect, at least I have that sort of background experience that it's not going to be as confronting and intimidating as I think it will be for other candidates. And just generally, I think that it means that a lot of my policy is informed by on the ground knowledge of the USU and of clubs and societies, and also working with like progressive individuals in the SLC.
Okay, on the topic of other candidates, which of the candidates do you think you might most align with, and which of the candidates do you think you might have the most disagreements with, and why?
So firstly, I would say that obviously on a left-wing basis, I really obviously am going to align with the Labour candidates, who I think are probably also going to run a progressive campaign similar to mine. And also in terms of politics, I think international students are really important at the moment, especially with everything that's happening in relation to COVID-19. I think international students specifically are extremely vulnerable. It's based on some of the conversations I've had on WeChat, where a lot of Chinese international students specifically who came over late because of COVID-19, then maybe had a week of tutorials and then went into quarantine again because of everything that's happening in Australia. They're in a really difficult situation, and I think you need to have people who understand that and who have those connections and represent them in board. As well as like, I know Vicky has also, besides me, has worked with the USU as a campus activities coordinator, and I respect that she has that experience and also probably administrative knowledge. In terms of individuals I may not work well with, I think quite obviously like the Liberal candidates, I think we're not generally on the same wavelength. I think that how the Liberal Party kind of functions, it is in some ways anti-union, or it has worked against, I think, really key principles of, I guess, supporting student culture, the Ramsay Centre being an example that I think works against student culture that I know the Liberal Party really endorsed. And I also just think that some Liberal candidates have been involved in stuff like stacking scandals, which I think doesn't really speak to the principles of what the USU stands for.
Cool.
So Vicky, in our interview with her, when we asked her where she would cut $1 million from the USU budget, she said that she would cut it from MAD and other kind of charitable initiatives.
Right, okay.
She also described herself as being a candidate more around like the center of politics. As like a left-wing activist candidate or someone who's styling them as such. Do you think that you're compatible with that?
I mean, on a political basis, like a left-wing political basis, I think a centrist is someone who is, I guess, like implicit in the way the structures currently work. I just think that groups, I think where Vicky and like probably other candidates are coming from is like she has that experience in student culture and from like campus activities coordinator, which I respect in like that side of dimension. So if it's two parts of how you can understand who I am, one side is the progressive, one side is student culture. But I would say that on the experience with Vicky, I think we'd really understand each other on that side. And I think that anyone who is a centrist is someone who's just responsive to the best argument in terms of politics. I think that in the ways that we would work together, if we were to come to work together, it would be in a left-wing way. And I think that she would be responsive to that, purely by virtue of like things that would, I think, benefit what she cares about, which I think is international student rights. From having close communications with those based on like what I've seen her and how she behaves in like WeChat groups. So I don't necessarily think it would end up being a conflict. It would just be, I guess, a navigation or a negotiation in some ways.
Okay, and if you had to cut $1 million from the USU's budget, where would you cut it from?
So firstly, I would say it's a rearrangement of how I would do some events. So for example, if it was still a physical situation, a physical like campus experience, first I would try and rearrange the way we do festivals. So a lot of the way that we do festivals like Pop Fest or Sustainability Festival is that you bring in a lot of outside entertainment. So for example, Pop Fest, you might bring in like cosplay people or panelists. What I would try and replace that with is more collaboration with clubs and societies. So what the USU currently does is they give a expression of interest to clubs and societies, specifically performing arts societies, if we're kind of going off Pop Fest. And they don't have a lot of time to actually prepare, so they don't get super involved. But what I'd love to see is if we had to change the way we organize festivals, it would be with more inclusion of clubs, societies, instead of trying to really fund these sort of outside influences that I think just generally don't get as much student engagement as well. I would try and cut from Incubate as well for a couple reasons. Firstly, Incubate provides startup grants and which has a benefit for students, but it's also something that is accessible from other areas. Like I think FAST also gives grants. You can get grants from outside sources as well. So it's not necessarily a unique benefit, whereas something like clubs or even reviews are things that I would really want to protect and make sure they don't get cut funding from, just because that's something that a lot of students rely on. I also think that based on some of the criteria around Incubate, they do look at stuff about how your business has run previous to what it's being brought forth with Incubate. And I think that people who have more connections, more social and economic capital are obviously going to be beneficial for that. So it might create these sort of hierarchies. I also think is a very specific kind of initiative that I think a lot of students aren't accessing, but again, like the regular programs, those stuff really are something that a lot of students access. And I also don't want to cut from things like food outlets, because what could happen is that food prices could skyrocket, and I think that's really important that we have affordable food options on campus. Other possibilities is to also remove something like Bright Ideas or creative grants. I have so much respect for creative grants and like the Verge Gallery, but I guess if this wasn't like a real big issue, I would rather take from something like that than probably cut more staff, as we've seen happen over the past COVID-19 year.
Yeah, so do you think that the staff at the USU needed to be fired and stood down recently as a result of the decrease in money coming in?
Did they have to be, what did you say, sorry, at the beginning?
So do you think that the staff at the USU needed to be fired recently as a result of the decrease in money?
So I was one of the staff who was stood down. And then I also resigned because of the USU election. So I understand that this is one of the really tough situations where I basically all my friends, all my community within the USU basically was stood down, and people who I have so much respect for and who have done so much good work, who coordinated reviews and festivals and who basically run the clubs and societies office, were either made redundant or stood down. Whether I can say that it was necessary is, I guess, out of my purview, because I obviously am not privy to like the budgetary information that gets put out in camera. But also, I have heard that the issue is that the USU is facing issues of solvency. They're uncertain about whether they can come back next semester. All these sort of difficult issues and austerity measures, I guess, are precipitating the life of the USU, and hopefully will ensure that a USU job is there when the situation allows it to become. But I also think there are ways that I think the USU could have navigated, hopefully, staff. For example, instead of, I guess, so certain staff that were made redundant were because organized festivals on campus, and no longer can you actually hold a festival on campus, so why would you keep that person around? But the way I kind of wish that the USU, if it had the potential in terms of money to do, was to diversify the way that the staff actually functions. So instead of doing festivals on on campus, how can you move a festival online? So how can you convert something like Pulp and do it in an online way, which I think a lot of collectives are specifically trying to do. And also, like, for example, like the CNS and how to still support and run CNS online. So I think a CNS staff group and festival group and all those sort of groups would have been really helpful for that. But whether the actual financials were there to support it is something that I don't feel I was privy or have the right to comment on at the moment.
Cool. Do you think the CEO, heads of department, and board directors should have taken a pay cut during this time, or should they take a pay cut going to the future?
I mean, I think it's for me to be I think it'd be very, I guess, arrogant or privileged to say that they should have all taken a pay cut, because I don't know the background of each of the individuals. I don't know the socioeconomic status of these individuals, and I would never, I guess, like publicly shame someone because they refuse to give up their money. But with that being said, I would have taken a pay cut if I were a board director. I would have advocated for it, but I would have advocated for it on an anonymous basis, in the sense that people who did the pay cut people who didn't opt in for a pay cut wouldn't be exposed, because I just don't think it's in my place to say that someone should have been willing to sacrifice their money in order to save this stuff. That's something that I personally would advocate for and debate for and do. But I guess if you have a family to support, or if you are renting, that's just something that maybe isn't like sustainable for a lot of people.
Okay.
It's a privilege. It's a privilege for me to have to do that. You know what I mean?
Yep. So free access was introduced last year, and it obviously shook up the USU's financial situation quite a bit. Do you think that's still a viable situation, and would you advocate for it going forward, especially, I guess, in the recovery from this crisis?
I would say it should go forward, and there's a few reasons for that. So I think the universal student membership was one of the most incredible and progressive policy points that the USU's made since like voluntary student unionism became a thing. And it has made a massive impact on smaller clubs and societies, because if you have niche interests, I'm thinking specifically of crosstalk because I spoke to the president, Sam, and he said that things like the universal membership actually had a massive impact on their membership and their engagement. And so I think that it would really hit hard smaller and niche interests of clubs and societies, and that's something that I don't want to do. And I think that Clubs and Societies program is something that all students really look to and appreciate and really need during this time. So I really wouldn't want to cut or marginalize or affect students in that way, especially because going back to the old system, which was like $75 or $90 for student membership, is just not sustainable, especially because of all the issues happening around students who are losing their jobs and who have rent to pay or have to support their families. And so I think putting the problems of the USU onto all the members to like carry the burden, I don't necessarily think is, I guess, sustainable, to repeat the same word I used before, but I think there are other ways to cut funds and to make sure we support students in that way.
So what is your opinion on how successful the current board has been, and specifically, what is your opinion on kind of where its presidency?
Well, firstly, I want to say that I think that what I appreciate about this board specifically in comparison to maybe previous boards is that they have put forth, I guess, actively political motions. Like, for example, they came out against Ramsey Center, they came out in support of climate strikes. And I think that's a positive change in the way that the USU functions and the way the board functions. Other criticisms, I guess, could be that obviously, and this is a problem that's not necessarily specific to this board, is that a lot of board directors come in with a lot of these promises and don't often deliver, or don't often communicate their failings when they try to deliver, and that's something that I would appreciate to see more of. Other things that I think they do maybe not so well is that I was reading the board minutes or the summary by Pulp, and I know kind of where it points out that they didn't want to take a stance on things like pass fail in relation to students, and they wanted to defer to the SRC as like, I guess, like the left wing student organization or the activist body. And I just don't see the need to make them mutually exclusive. And I think that as a student organization, you should be able to be informed on a lot of the issues that are surrounding students at the moment, and should at least schedule it to be discussed at a further date where you are informed and take a stance, because that's what a lot of students are looking towards. Like, I've done a lot of work around the eviction of student accommodation and the suspend rent campaign, and it would have been really cool if someone had discussed that in more thorough detail rather than just kind of signing a petition.
Cool. And I guess this is kind of like our last kind of broad USU question.
Yeah.
What role do you think Pulp plays in reporting on the USU? Do you think that the current editorial team is afraid to criticize the organization, or do you think that the organization itself has too much control? Obviously, kind of like referring to their interview with Connor Ware, where the questions to us seemed quite easy, and like they weren't really interrogating properly, you know, what was like some pretty easily recognizable stuff.
I definitely think that there is too much reliance on Pulp as kind of the megaphone for what the USU is doing, in the sense of like, Pulp does not exist to, I guess, service the USU. The Pulp exists to critique and to hold the USU accountable. And even with Honi Soit, where they asked Honi Soit to do a pull out on the USU, I mean, I think the USU is relying just a little bit too much on student media to give them a positive review. I would say that I have a lot of respect for the Pulp journalists, like in the sense of like, I think that they have the politics. I like what's been happened with like the translations that they've been doing and being more inclusive of international students, which I think is really positive. But I would think my criticism is more so with the expectations that the USU is holding on Pulp, which I think is just genuinely unfair. And if the SRC did the same thing with Honi, I think it would be pretty outrageous. So I think there's more distancing and less reliance on them. And I guess a feedback to like the Pulp would be try and I guess be more willing to be critical, but I would want to examine further why they felt like they couldn't be more critical. I think that's more of a compelling issue.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience as a Pulp editor, Pulp functions in like a very different, obviously, but in some senses a similar way to the SRC, in that the USU was quite cautious when it established Pulp to kind of create a separation of editorial control.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's more room for the Pulp editors to be kind of like resisting the USU in that sense? And as a board director, like how would you encourage them to do so?
I mean, I'm very much in favor of the big separation, the resistance between any control between the USU and Pulp. I think that I would have conversations with people who were trying to use Pulp as this megaphone, and I would also approach Pulp and let them know that like it's very like from my personal experience as a board director, if I were a board director, would to be like you should be free to criticize and anything that I do and anything that other board directors do. And I would even, I guess, put forward, if I saw this happening repeatedly, I would try and put forward some form of motion in the USU to reaffirm the independence of Pulp, which I think is really important. I think just creating the environment and setting reminders to Pulp that they don't function as, I guess, like the stepping stool for the USU, and making sure like as a propaganda machine for the USU is important. Obviously we want to have a close relationship because they should be used in order to I guess platform a lot of the projects we're doing, like for example if we're involved in something like a sustainability week, but they also should have the platform in order to criticize sustainability week. And I think that's just conducive to really like good progress. Like I accept criticism of any student organization that I'm a part of, because that's how you figure out what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. And the reactions to articles when they're put out are also significant. And I think if we just have this sort of monocentric discussion about how the USU functions, that's just kind of when you get into like a forward loop of not actually doing anything or I guess changing it in any significant way. And I think having independent people who care enough about us to learn about us and criticize us is something that's something that's a benefit. Like that's like it's a privilege to have something like that.
Cool. All right. Well, let's move on to a couple more specific, I guess, policy questions or things about your policy statement. What would you say is your overall policy priority if you had to keep it sort of around one area, if possible? Because we had some candidates, you know, basically read out their entire policy statement to us when we asked them this question. So, yeah. So, what would you say your overall priority is in your policy statement?
Gosh. Okay. Well, I would say that in terms of priority, I consider priority what would I do as soon as I try and get into the USU, like what's the first thing that I'm thinking like I have to do this. And so it's going to be non-financial, so there's a lot of like obviously financial ideas that I have which I won't talk about in order to like keep it succinct, but I guess the non-financial priority would probably be first and foremost setting up communication channels where I can between clubs, societies and reviews, because I think they're in a really difficult position, and I think that it reaches the most amount of members in order to do that. And I think it's something that the USU hasn't been able to do as well in the past. And I think it's more important now because of all the layoffs in the CNS office, that you actually have board directors stepping up like they've never stepped up before to really compensate for a lot of those gaps. So that's something that I'd really would love to see.
Okay. Maddie, do you want to?
Yeah. So usually board candidates who are factionally aligned get help from their factionally aligned board directors. Are you receiving any help from Maya or Swaran?
So Maya is obviously like, as a friend, like gives me advice and stuff like that. She's not like actively involved because I'm pretty sure candidates aren't allowed. That's what I've been told. So yeah, she more so gives me broad advice, and I got a lot of advice from her last year as well, because like last year when she was just a board director, and I don't know if it was wrong or right, but she did give me like obvious help, and she was, I think, like part like my manager and Ellie's manager. So I've learned a lot enough from her last year to like not really need her fully this year.
Cool. And do you plan to continue as SRC and Barrow officer if elected to board? And if so, how are you planning on juggling a board role, an SRC role, and your studies?
Big questions, and really important questions as well. So obviously I will never step down from the environmental officer position while I'm in that position. That position for me is one of the most important positions I've ever been elected to, in my opinion. So the value of this year is that because I screwed up my progression, and because I knew that I was taking up this environmental officer position, I underloaded my degree. So I'm actually only doing one subject this semester. So I have a lot of free time to kind of concentrate on that sort of stuff. And so studies aren't as much a big deal. And also because it's in a COVID-19 world, my WEM isn't as significant as it would normally be. So, and also the role of the environmental officer isn't, I guess, as hands-on as it would normally be, for example, in terms of like being like organizing these mass like rallies that I would have normally been doing, but which I had been doing until COVID-19 kind of set in. But that's still a big part of my life. And also ideally, if I were elected to board, I would take up the environment officer portfolio. And so a lot of my work would hopefully complement each other. For example, around Sustainability Week, that would just be informed a lot by like my involvement in the Environment Collective, as well as consultation with different environmental CNS, which I already do as environment officer. And also because I had this USU job as a student activities officer, I would just, I guess, sub out what I was doing as working for the USU with this new job working for the USU. And so that's how I kind of can like rotate all these different positions together.
Right, and then I guess just kind of following on from that, as someone who's like quite heavily involved in collectives and activist movements on campus, like why are you running for the USU as opposed to the SRC? Do you think that you can do more as something with, you know, someone with left-wing inclinations on the board than the SRC, and like really how much influence can one activist director have on the organization?
I mean, I think that there's often a conversation about why is the left-wing person choosing to run for the USU and not the SRC. I think that the SRC has so many left-wing options. Like, for example, I can think of basically anyone in grassroots who could just completely take up the presidential role or take up any sort of role in the SRC and do a fantastic job. That doesn't really need to be me. And I think the harder position is kind of doing the USU job. I think it's a really difficult thing to go into a room with people who maybe disagree with you, maybe want to depoliticize the USU, and having these conversations and convincing them. That's just like a very difficult thing to do. So I guess it's more of there's more value, I guess, in trying to send that left-wing person out to do that. I guess it's easier for me to be like, I'm going to be SRC president. But I also felt like I didn't have, I guess, the same background administrative knowledge of the SRC, whereas I had performed all this research in the USU that I really felt like, unlike previous years, that I knew how to instill left-wing politics in the actual mechanisms that exist within the USU. I think also because I have a lot of this experience from the USU, I have a lot more respect. I think a lot of the members of the USU and the staff already kind of know I'm an activist, so I don't think they're going to be coming on the back foot and realizing that I'm not going to be bringing them to the USU. So I think there's value also in that. I think that there's an incorrect assumption that the USU and the SRC kind of they don't have to both be left wing. Like, for example, to phrase that better, the SRC is a left-wing institution, which is an activist institution, but that's not to say that the USU, therefore, should not have to be a left-wing institution because the SRC is already taking up that mantle. Any student organization, I believe, has to make a political decision about the politics they want to represent. Even deciding that you're not political is a political decision, especially when you're dealing with like political events like Pride Week, or you know, when you have buildings that are named after colonizers. Like, just not willing to take a stance on those issues is being complicit in the fact that is a political situation that you're just letting kind of exist on its own. It's a decision about what politics you want it to have. and I wanted to have left-wing politics, and that's what I'll advocate for. And I think there is a culture change that is happening within the USU, specifically when you see like the motions that I've mentioned before, and when you have I guess candidates who come from left-wing backgrounds. And I think there's a lot of us even running in this campaign, so I do think that there is a lot of potential for change, and I just want to be assured that the people who are on this campus who definitely want this left-wing representation, who want to be supported, have that sort of avenue in me, and that's really what makes me passionate about what I'm trying to do.
Cool. And so your policy speaks to a lot of structural environmental changes, but it also kind of outlines a lot of sustainability measures such as subsidized cups and Dixie cups. The USU tends to favor the latter measure, and as far as I can tell, it tends to favor the latter measure in order to kind of conceal the fact that the environmental structural kind of changes aren't happening. Why do you think that promoting such individual action is compatible with your vision of being an activist board director?
So firstly, I would acknowledge that the previous environment officer positions were taken up by people who had very little interest in supporting the environment. I even think that Wilkins-Wheat, who was a member of the Liberal Party, took up the environment officer position and had little regard, I guess, I perceive as being little regard for both dimensions, sustainability and the actual activist side. But the reason why I guess I'm putting in the sustainability measures is because that is a big part of the USU, and the USU has that responsibility because of its involvement in outlets. And ignoring that side, I guess, is just a bit of a waste. If you can have that influence, why not just try and actually have that influence and actually do it to the point where it's at the level which you think is successful? But obviously, I don't advocate or believe that individual change is the most significant at the moment. I believe in structural and systematic change to achieve not having like massive climatic effects on the world. And I think of that because, when you think about something like a 10-year gap that we have in order to really affect the environment, you have to think about what's like the most like efficient way of going about it. And that for me is systematic change rather than individual change. And I think that in some ways USU is a system, and I think that involving it in changes is really positive because it has a multiplier effect where it influences the practices and the way that people orientate themselves on campus. I don't think that my ideas on a systemic level are impossible, and I really think that they have a history. So for example, before voluntary student unionism, the USU really did get involved in around a big systemic issues like around mining and fracking. And I have like old zines in the in the SRC from the USU that I thought were from the SRC, which they were talking about logging and all that sort of stuff. And those conversations have changed, but that doesn't mean to say they can't go back to that, because when you have things like thousands of students walking off the campus and USU actually taking an engaged look at that, I think that is, I guess, a platform that is being created out of that. And I think it's becoming more and more mainstream to discuss issues of the climate and to be willing to change on a systemic basis and, like, I guess, lobby the USU and so the university in forms of ethical investment. Even the sustainability strategy which is happening this year, which is being in consultation with the Sydney Environmental Institute and being in consultation with the USU, is a form of systemic change that the university is trying to prioritize. Like, they were discussing about the investment, and this year was supposed to be this really influential year about it. And so I would say that now more than ever, we have to be having these conversations about systemic climate change and even individual climate change, environmental change in all forms. And I think that that's kind of the way that we have to go ahead in all student organizations and organizations broadly.
Right, and sorry, you'll have to forgive me, someone is incessantly ringing my doorbell. So in your policy statement, you've included lobby to change the name of the Wentworth building to something decolonial.
Yep.
Do you not think that the renaming process should be given as much weight as the denaming? It seems to me quite curious that you haven't suggested potential name changes, rather referring it to...
It's okay.
That's my doorbell again.
Okay.
Something like decolonial, which to me seems quite broad.
I know, that was very broad. I adopted this policy based on the ACAR Honi that I read, I think maybe last year, and it was an article that I read by Himath and Georgia, and they were talking about the renaming of Wentworth and the significance of that. And they brought up the idea of naming it after an Indigenous warrior, which I would completely be in support of. That's what I would want. But I don't feel like it's the USU's place to just be like, we're going to name it after this Indigenous person. I think it has to be consultation with communities, with groups like the Autonomous Collective Against Racism, and have those really big consultations, because obviously I bring in a lot of white privilege, and I don't think it's my place to rename a building named after a colonizer with whatever idea I have. It has to come from someone else, and it has to come from people who were genuinely affected by it. And I guess like the one reason that wasn't, like, I didn't actively just say an Indigenous warrior, is that I didn't want to seem tokenistic, and I didn't want to just be too broad in what I was trying to say. But it's just, that's something that I think has to be in greater consultation than I think what I want to say.
Do you not think that just referring to it as something decolonial though in itself is quite tokenistic and broad?
True. I mean, I take that criticism on, and I think that that's something that I will probably change if I make when I make the policy public, and I'll probably adopt the idea of an Indigenous warrior, or at least have that name has to be in consultation with communities who are effectively who have a lot more like have the lived experience or have knowledge of what they would want it to be turned into. You can read it as being that then.
Cool. And then just kind of like one last question, just because I'm quite conscious of time.
Yeah.
Staff fired and more layoffs likely, how can you reconcile being a unionist and a board director, which is effectively making you a boss, and overseeing significant job cuts?
I mean, that's one of the most complicated issues at the moment. I think it's one of the most conflicting issues that you're in, where you have to rely on the continuity of the union, and that came with massive job cuts and cuts in basically every area. But I think at that time it was necessary, and I guess making sure that I'm not part of the problem of further cuts, but part of the solutions for bringing those workers back on is kind of what I kind of want to see. Instead of trying to continue the problem, but trying to figure out how to better support workers. And that is through stuff like supporting the May 1 movement for workers, and hoping the USU also takes a stance on that. I'll be part of things like car convoys around that, and I have been historically. And I think also making sure that workers who, for example, a lot of workers were really confused about JobKeeper and whether they came under that, and so better communication support for workers who are trying to do that. I guess taking stances against the university, so against the government when they are making those decisions about JobKeeper. So I know that the SLC was doing really big campaigns around that, which I would have liked to see the USU being more involved in. So I guess those are kind of examples of even if there are small ways of trying to support workers rather than being part of the problem, which I think is just abetted by the fact that we're in a really exceptional situation in terms of COVID-19.
Right, but so it does seem like a tiny bit of a contradiction to me though, to say that you support the previous job cuts, but in the same sense that you'll be supporting the May 1 workers movement. Given that you're going to be in a position where you're directly affecting workers, why do you support those job cuts?
So I wouldn't say, so when we're in, like, for example, the previous workers convoys that I've been involved in, they aren't always about we want our jobs back. A lot of them about the benefits they want to see from the better benefits that they're getting from old work and also from the government. That's what kind of those movements are about, rather than we need our jobs back, because I think people are aware that in this current situation, a lot of people just aren't able to financially support bringing all the staff back. Whether that is, I guess, like other solutions could be like, I guess, like we said, like the pay cuts to bring in job workers. I can't say that it's just not, if we care about the USU and we care about making sure that student unionism is a thing, which I do believe it should be. And if I look at the fact that if you were brought into the USU, you'd have a fiduciary duty in order to make sure that the USU is, I guess, supported and like continues on. You have to be able to make those decisions. I think all around things have been cut. I mean, even as a staff member, I've been cut. I think the whole behavior on part of the USU was the lack of consultation, which shouldn't have happened. I think in terms of being involved in the staff movement and these different movements, they're not necessarily, I think it's a misrepresentation to say that staff aren't aware that they couldn't be kept on for various reasons. It was just about the conditions that they were given, the communication they were given, about the rights they're receiving afterwards, about the assurances they're going to get if they were to come back, and making sure that as soon as we can, we bring them back and we prioritize bringing them back, is something that I think is more in the conversation and more how I reconcile those two priorities in my mind.
So as a board director, your priority would be like less about kind of like maintaining the staff jobs and like preventing or like rather your priority is more about like the long-term kind of like success of the union rather than like the staff cuts?
I think it's, I don't necessarily think it's something that you have to argue in either way. In order to get staff their jobs back, you kind of just need to have a union there for them. And if you were to bring all staff back and you couldn't support them for long enough and the USU just kind of crumbled, then no one would have a job at the end of the day. I guess it's looking in long term about how to actually bring those people back and have a job waiting for them. And in the meantime, trying to make the conditions as durable as possible for the workers who are being affected, and advocating, and then using your platform to really make sure the government is trying to support them in all workers outside of the USU as well, which is really important.
All right, cool. I don't think we have any time for any more questions. Chuyi, do you have anything else you wanted to ask?
No, I've got nothing to add, unless you want to add something right at the end.
No, I think
if you think there's nothing
that you wanted to add.
No, I just think that I think the USU is a really important election, and I really hope that it goes well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have
Thank
a lovely
you.
day.
You too. Goodbye.